There are a lot of Jewish people who never would have thought twice about wearing a Magen David, a Star of David, or a kippah, or kind of other indicators of Jewishness, who talk now about, taking the mezuzah down from the door, or tucking in their Magen David, or putting a baseball cap on over their kippah. And that's really, really become intensified over the past, since October 7th, 2023, and with this surge of anti-Semitism that we've seen. And so we do see what we call what's been called among those who study such things like this countervailing surge of people returning to or turning to synagogues and to Jewish community life, and to this sense of solidarity and connection and pride. But we also see a lot of people just kind of staying under the radar because they're afraid of what will happen if they're out as Jews at work or at school or on the street.
Were you too young to know you were a girl or a boy?
Oh, I hated the skin that I was in. I thought I was ugly. I thought I was unlovable. I couldn't leave my house without people staring at me or making rude remarks.
There's a sense, I think, or a message that many of us have received that it's okay to be a Jew as long as you're the right kind of Jew.
Just imagine what it would be like for you when you get out of prison after, 10 years in there for something you didn't do.
Approximately 6 or 7 policemen attacked me and put in my pocket a big quantity of drugs.
If we can choose how we live well, then do we not have the right to choose how we die well? And how do we do that with dignity?
There's never a moment where I am not in pain. It's exhausting. This bottom line is what it is.
I was born with a congenital indifference. My arm, I have my elbow, but it was like underdeveloped from here out.
54% of those with disabilities are not working. If you're an employer, hire somebody with a disability. You won't regret it.
I've learned that us neurotypical people are the people who really need to learn from neurodiverse individuals. We are the aliens of this planet.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season will inspire you to empathize with people who are regularly marginalized and misunderstood. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Today on Purposeful Empathy, we're discussing the rise of anti-Semitism and what it feels like to carry Jewish identity in public spaces today. My guest is Rabbi Lisa Grushcow, a scholar, a community leader, and the first woman to serve as senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel Beth Shalom in Montreal. She's also one of Canada's most thoughtful voices in interfaith dialogue. In this conversation, we explore several themes, including why anti-Semitism is such an ancient and persistent hatred, what Jewish identity actually means, not just as a religion, but also as a history and a culture and a deep sense of belonging. And we discuss how Jewish communities today are navigating a very real surge in anti-Semitism, alongside something quieter but equally painful, a sense of conditional welcome. Finally, I want to acknowledge the moment in which this episode is being released. Our conversation was recorded a few weeks after the horrific terrorist attacks at Bondi Beach in Australia, an attack that rocked Jewish communities across the globe. For many Jewish people, that attack reinforced a growing sense of vulnerability in public spaces. Since then, violence in the Middle East has surged further, layering heartbreak on heartbreak, adding more pain and tension to an already fragile moment. But one of the most important ideas behind this podcast is that empathy is never a zero-sum game. The suffering of one group never cancels out the suffering of another. And in moments like this, it takes moral courage to resist the temptation to reduce entire communities to political headlines or geopolitical conflicts. Jewish people, like any people, deserve to be seen in the fullness of their humanity. So this conversation is an invitation to do something both simple and difficult, to listen carefully, to hold complexity, and to enlarge our circle of empathy, especially in the face of escalating violence, division, and hate. Thanks for watching.
So welcome to the show, Rabbi.
Thank you, and thank you for that generous introduction.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you. You've been a guest speaker in a couple of my classes over the years, and I've had the chance to speak at your temple, and I feel like we're getting to know each other a little bit better, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. So thanks for making the time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
I suppose sometimes when people hear the word rabbi, that they might have some assumptions. So I wonder if you could maybe describe the role, especially to someone who's never had a close relationship with Jewish life or practice.
Sure. I mean, it's such an interesting question. Rabbi in its origin simply means teacher. One of the differences between Jewish clergy and clergy in some other faiths is that we're not really meant to be or seen to be an intermediary. I don't, alas, have a direct line to the divine, but rabbis are meant to be teachers, spiritual leaders, community leaders, but ordinary people alongside that, of course.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because I was born into a Christian family where, yeah, the priest is that intermediary. So that's so interesting. I wonder if there's like a moment in time, or maybe a series of moments in your life that could illuminate the path that you felt called to in terms of your scholarship and then maybe your spiritual leadership.
Sure, and there's differences here too in vocabulary. For whatever reason, I think Christian denominations are much more comfortable using language of discernment or calling or all of those things as the way to finding a role as a religious leader. That isn't always Jewish language. I would say that in my own experience, I started off being drawn to the rabbinate simply because it was a connection of learning and teaching and community building and trying to kind of do one's part in whatever small way we can to make this world a better place. All of that was very compelling to me. But there have been some moments, or there was a moment in my life where it really felt like, all right, this was the way in which I wanted to serve. This was the path forward for me. And so that added clarity, I think, to the sense of meaning and purpose in the role.
So I take it you grew up Jewish, right? That wouldn't be wrong to say. Yeah, okay. You're born into the faith, and then you studied it quite deeply, earning a PhD. So I imagine that you have traversed a lot of important texts. I wonder whether or not there is something in the faith that you find so exquisite and so beautiful that you might want to share right now. Putting you on the spot.
I mean, there's so much, really. The challenge is just finding one thing. But I think actually, in my answer, I'll question the question a little bit. I recently finished reading a book by Sarah Hurwitz called As a Jew, which is a really interesting reflection on Jewish identity, both historically and in this moment. And one of the points that she makes is that the default vocabulary that we use doesn't always map well onto Judaism, right? So the language of faith in particular it makes sense that we use that language. We're in a primarily Christian context, but it has all of these binaries in it, right? Faith versus action, or faith versus unbelief, or whatever it might be. And one of the things that I love about Judaism is I find it a very integrated religion. So faith is part of it, but peoplehood is part of it. The notion of mitzvah, commandedness, is really key. The notion of brit, of covenant, of being in covenant with God, is really central. The notion of Torah, of teaching, is very much at the heart. And so there's this whole different vocabulary and set of ideas and wisdom that we have for how to approach life, which I find very, very rich.
And it's so interesting, like, you've pursued your path, you've earned your doctoral degree, and here you are still referring to a new book that you've just read. So the ongoing learning and unfolding of understanding Judaism is still sort of very much alive in you.
But I think that's true of anybody who's a teacher, right? I'm sure you know this and do this yourself. And I've experienced this from you, right? That one is you're always learning. That's not something that stops. And that is within, obviously not only within Judaism, but within Judaism, that's a core value that learning is lifelong, right? That you don't stop at a certain point. There's a wonderful story that's told about a theology professor in a rabbinical school who taught his students one day what he believed about God, and the next day he asked the students, and they kind of parroted back what he had said, and he said, "No, that's wrong." And they say, what do you mean that's wrong? That's what you taught us yesterday." And he said, "Well, that was yesterday." Right? And I think one of the reasons that people sometimes walk away from religion is that our spiritual, our theological, our existential understandings stop with what we learned maybe when we were kids. But we wouldn't do that in any other area of life. We wouldn't want to just be reading the books we were reading when we were 10 or 12, or thinking about math or politics or literature or anything in the same way, right? And so too with religion.
And in your role, I just wonder, Catholic Church has struggled with sort of people who have sort of left the church because they find it less relevant to modern day society, or that there's some old, very kind of what's the word I want to use, like the rigor and the dogmas of the church that
Calcified.
get in the way. Yeah, I
Mhm.
wonder how you make the teachings relevant to today.
At the beginning you asked what are the responses to folks on encountering a rabbi. And so I think in some ways, those of us who don't look the way that someone might call up in their mind's eye, and if what comes to your mind and you hear rabbi is you think,
Man.
long beard, gray hair, male, all of those things, then already, I have a certain advantage in the sense that and I think this is true for many women who are clergy in many faiths, that people see you and they hear the title and they think, oh, maybe religion isn't what I thought it was. Maybe there's more room and there's more openness than I thought there was. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But the other, I think, is that Judaism has always been an interpretive tradition, a living tradition, a dynamic tradition. It's always, to some degree, kind of been a balance of what's timeless and what responds to the times that we're in. And so the fact that we're such an interpretive religion, that we have our core texts, but they've always been our jumping off points rather than the end of the story and the final word, it gives, I think, a lot of room to not to reject tradition, but to bring our own hearts and minds into it.
Yeah, that speaks to me. You alluded earlier to the Jewish identity, right? I think it's often discussed as religion or culture or history. I wonder how you would understand what it means to be Jewish.
It's really all of the above and then some, I would say, right? And so if you think about religion as faith, it makes absolutely no sense that there are Jews who are proudly identified Jews who will easily say, I don't believe in God, right? But that's not paradoxical within Judaism. I mean, for those of us for whom religion and God is an important part of our Jewish identity, of course, that's central. My own belief is I don't think we would have survived just as a culture without that religious aspect, without that sense of connection to the divine. But because it's such a multifaceted identity, people find their entryways different places. And there's this overarching idea of what's called Klal Yisrael, the greater community of Israel, in the sense of Israel being the Jewish people, and the sense that our history and our destiny are intertwined. So as different as I might look from a Hasidic Jew in Outremont, or a secular Jew in Israel, or a Jew in Africa or Asia or anywhere else in the world, that we have this connection to and care for one another. There's that familial piece of it as well.
Community also very, very
Yeah.
important. Yeah. So I wonder what it feels like to carry Jewish identity in public spaces today. I can imagine that there are moments of pride, but also now increasingly deep vulnerability and maybe even moving towards fear.
It's very fraught right now,
Mhm.
right? In part because it's not an irrational fear. We see what's happening to folks who are identifiably Jewish, whether it's a kid on a college campus or a Chabad gathering on a beach in Australia. We see what happens. Um, and so there are a lot of Jewish people who never would have thought twice about wearing a Magen David, a Star of David, or a kippah, or kind of other indicators of Jewishness, who talk now about, taking the mezuzah down from the door, or tucking in their Magen David, or putting a baseball cap on over their kippah. And that's really, really become intensified over the past, since October 7th, 2023, and with this surge of anti-Semitism that we've seen. And so we do see what we call what's been called among those who study such things like this countervailing surge of people returning to or turning to synagogues and to Jewish community life, and to this sense of solidarity and connection and pride. But we also see a lot of people just kind of staying under the radar because they're afraid of what will happen if they're out as Jews at work or at school or on the street. And that's really it's concerning, obviously, and it's sobering because you have, it's not good to be in any kind of closet. We had a session with Mayor Valerie Plante last year at Temple, small conversation, and one of my members, who happens to be an francophone gay man in his 60s, Jewish, and he said, when I was a young adult, I had to pass as straight. I had to be closeted in the streets of this city as a gay man to be safe. And I don't want to feel like that as a Jew, right? And so it's something I think that we need to pay attention to it. For me, in my own role, in some ways I'm more vulnerable, in some ways I'm less vulnerable. I'm rarely in a setting where, I'm not there in some capacity where people have a sense of who I am and what I stand for and what I'm associated with and what I do. So I'm much less likely to get a kind of random piece of anti-Semitism thrown my way. But of course, being at a synagogue, we're more of a target.
Mhm. I had two follow-up questions that came to me. One that's burning is, I wonder if you could speak to your own self-care, self-compassion, self-empathy practices, given the weight, not just of the moment, about what we're talking about, but also sort of in the role of all the work you do with funerals or marriages or people seeking advice or turning to you for guidance. Like, how do you care for yourself? Just as an aside to the conversation that we're having.
I don't think I see those as separate or contradictory things at all, right? I mean, I think about the class that you teach on happiness and some of the scholarship about that having to do with meaning, right? That if you feel like what you're doing has meaning, that contributes to a sense of well-being. And so there is that, absolutely. Like, not a morning comes that I don't feel like I'm trying to do something worthwhile. Some days I succeed more than others, but it's, to feel like you're contributing to something, that's really there, and part of something bigger than oneself, that's there. I will say that the rhythms of the Jewish calendar and the Jewish week, as much as there's an extra layer of involvement on that as a religious leader, simply the fact that Shabbat comes every week and whatever else is happening Friday morning and Friday night and Saturday morning, I'm surrounded by music and prayer and community. And it just, it reinforces the sense of being privileged and fortunate and to do what I do and to be where I am. And that more than compensates for the rest of it. You know, we talk sometimes about emphasizing and leaning into the joys more than the oys. I think that if all one experienced of Jewish life was anti-Semitism and persecution and hate, of course you would want to run in the opposite direction. But part of my role and part of my life's work is getting to help bring so much of the joy of it forward, right? And so to be surrounded by people of different generations and people asking questions and learning and leaning in, and it's beautiful, right? And so that replenishes the rest.
And for those who are listening or watching and are unfamiliar with Shabbat, and maybe there's a bit of me in there too, could you describe what the purpose of Shabbat is and how it plays out in your life?
So Shabbat is a day of rest. Traditionally, it goes from just before sundown Friday to when you see 3 stars in the sky on Saturday night. Different denominations or forms of Judaism mark it in different ways, but the core ideas of Shabbat are that it's a day of rest, which is different than not working, right? It's a day of, if I can say this, actively resting, being in the world differently, spending time differently, with synagogue, with family, with community, kind of taking a step back from the everydayness of the rest of life, to feed one's soul, to reconnect with what matters, to feel a part of a whole, right? It goes back biblically to the notion that God created the world in 6 days and then rested. And there's a great teaching from our sages of like hundreds and hundreds of years ago where they said, well, it's impossible. Like nobody can get their work done in 6 days, right? Like, what does it mean? Say you get your work done in 6 days and you rest. The work is never ending, or it can be. And their answer is when you reach Shabbat, when you reach the end of the week, you have to act ki'ilu, as if your work has been done. And then you think about how differently does your mind work when you put down the to-do list.
I just took
From
a
an
deep
academic
breath as you were
perspective, right?
speaking.
You take a breath, you think about the model of sabbatical, right? All of that goes back to Shabbat, this notion that you can kind of think and be in the world differently if you take that time to be in the world differently. And I think it's a great, great, great insight that is incredibly countercultural in the world that we inhabit, right? Because it's a day that's not about doing, it's a day that's about being.
Yeah, that speaks to me. I think, the world could take a page from Judaism when it comes to Shabbat, just as a practice of not slowing down and intentionally being present in a different way. I really like that. That's very strong. Very speaks to me. I remember the second question, and it's circling back to sort of how Jews may be feeling in the world today. When I spoke on Yom Kippur at your temple, a woman in the audience after the presentation asked very sincerely, how come people are not empathizing with us more? I know you can't be in her shoes to know exactly what she meant, but I wonder if maybe you could explore that question that she was asking, maybe illuminate something for people who are watching or listening.
There's been a real feeling of isolation and aloneness in lots of the Jewish world, again, since October 7th. Especially, I think, for those of us who inhabit mostly progressive or liberal circles, right? And so many of us are used to kind of traveling in the world as Jews, but not in an insular or ghettoized way, but very much as, full citizens and neighbors and full participants in society, who have experienced a real cutting off, and I would say a real absence of empathy in the experience of there's so many layers to this. It's hard to know where to start. There is a sense, I think, or a message that many of us have received that it's okay to be a Jew as long as you're the right kind of Jew, as long as you sign the right petition, show up at the right rallies, have the right beliefs, disavow the wrong beliefs, find a party line and follow that without asking questions. It's a very conditional acceptance. And it's quite jarring to think that you have an unconditional relationship and to discover that it's a conditional relationship. And I think that some of it stems from part of what we were talking about before, right? From not understanding that Judaism is peoplehood. So whatever I might think about the Netanyahu government, I have family in Israel. I have friends in Israel. Half the world's Jewish population is in Israel. It's a country to which I have long spiritual and historical ties. How can I not care about that place and be invested in that place? And I think that's true for the majority of Jews, not all, but the majority. And so to have that core piece of identity being, don't even know the right word for it, being denigrated,
that's what
or being seen as not worthy of empathy or care or concern or humanity because you have that. So I'll give an example. There was a dialogue I was in, and we were talking about what is it that we're worried about. And it was meant to be a dialogue that was locally focused, because one of the things I really believe is, as many statements as we may make over here, nothing we do here is going to make peace in the Middle East. I wish it were otherwise, but I really don't think that's the case. I think that what we can do is help increase understanding and knowledge, our own and that of others, certainly, but fundamentally, we have a responsibility locally, right, to make this community, this country, this city as safe and as good for as many people as we can, right? This is not meant to be a war zone where we are. So I raised my concern that there had been, Molotov cocktails and shots fired at Jewish schools. And I worry when I send my kid to school in the mornings. And the response I got to that was, maybe I've been was someone saying, well, maybe I've been so entirely focused on the suffering of children in Gaza that, I just can't find it in me to care about that. And the notion that that's an either or, that one's safety or the safety of one's children is something that can be kind of dismissed as a debating point, that's hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a lot to absorb, but I'm fully with you when I'm listening to you speak that is legitimate. I do plan to ask some questions about how non-Jews, the community of non-Jews, can be allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. But I want to ask first what you think people most often misunderstand about how anti-Semitism manifests.
There's a lot of debate about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think that obviously there are distinctions between the two. There are some ways in which historically, and here I speak specifically about a very specific history in terms of the former Soviet Union, in which anti-Zionism was weaponized as anti-Semitism. And so the two are not as easily extricated as I think we would like to think. I think that there's a tremendous misunderstanding of Zionism that says that Zionism means complete support for any given Israeli government, which the moment you set foot in Israel, is impossible, because there's so much dissension and debate and free argument in that society. So I think there's a misunderstanding of the ways in which anti-Zionism manifests as anti-Semitism, this notion that, it's not a reasonable or respectful thing to say to a Jew, you're only okay if you condemn Israel. That's the condition by which we can, be nice to you and be okay with you being safe in this society. And I think that there's a lot of, don't know if I want to use the language of microaggressions, but there are a lot of situations which are not blatant anti-Semitism, not a swastika on a synagogue, or not somebody yelling at my congregants when they're leaving services, though all of those things have happened. Um, but more, a kid who's in a university classroom scared to say that they're Jewish because they know that someone's going to turn around and accuse them of genocide. Um, or the second thought that you have to give to, am I going to bring my kids to a Jewish holiday celebration in a public space because you're afraid of violence, right? So all of those things that as Jews we have to think about and carry and be concerned about because of how others think about Judaism or Jews, all of that I would put under that umbrella of anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the things we've really learned from the anti-racist movement is how much someone cannot think of themselves consciously or intentionally or maliciously as a racist in any way, but there are certain aspects of systemic racism and psychological racism that have just been built into our society that we've inherited and either question or don't. And the same is true with anti-Semitism. And and I think that's part of why it's so sobering that in progressive circles there has been this real resistance to taking anti-Semitism seriously, because it really does draw on a lot of these same insights to say, I'm not calling somebody a bad person. I am saying that there are these long, deep fault lines of anti-Semitism in the culture that we inhabit. And so we can't be surprised or say that we have no part in it when they erupt.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, in your public role, how do you help communities distinguish between legitimate critique, difficult conversation and dialogue, and rhetoric that crosses into that dehumanization or even harm?
I remember years and years ago when I was a student still, doing research and work on human rights and Canada's hate speech, and the notion that what is illegal is not free speech. What's illegal is the promotion of hatred against an identifiable group. I don't know if that's still the language that's used, but to me it seems pretty helpful, right? Are you promoting hatred against an identifiable group by what you're doing in a conversation or with an action? I really believe there's a huge difference between unsafe space and uncomfortable space. And I think especially as educational institutions, we need to lean into uncomfortable space. Like there has to be space to say, I think this, you think that. How can we hear each other? How can we do that from a position of curiosity and empathy and care? Like that's vitally important to what it means to be in a free and open and diverse society, right? I would never in a lifetime want to shut that down. And I get concerned when people use unsafe too readily, right? But I do think certain situations and certain rhetoric crosses that line to be unsafe. I think that even if you look at them, I'm bringing up all the fraud examples, right? People using the language of genocide very freely. If you think a genocide is happening, then it's a very easy step from that to say that you can act with impunity and by any means necessary against anyone who you think is connected to that happening or to that place, right? And so all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but fairly quickly, it becomes okay to target a synagogue, to target any Jewish gathering in a way that you don't see Russians acting against Ukrainians outside of Russia and Ukraine, or Ukrainians acting against Russians, right? This sense of kind of collective association and responsibility without nuance, without care, kind of painting everybody with the same brush. I wrote after there was the swastika in our synagogue a number of months ago, nobody came and said to us, hey, what's your take on the politics of Israel and Palestine? Do you support a two-state solution? What do you think about, Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and these other political personalities? No, for them, it was a synagogue. We're Jewish. That for them, whoever did it is enough, right? And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Totally.
But it's the reality that we're in, and it's a really troubling one. I think the other piece I would add in terms of what I think we need to be more thoughtful about understanding is I do think there's a lot of binaries right now in universities, among other places, between, colonial and decolonial, between powerful and powerless. And I think that the world is and has always been more complicated than that, right? It's possible to have certain privilege, say, as a white person, related to people who come from racialized minorities, which is very real, and also have certain lack of privilege or power as a woman in a patriarchal society, even as a white or a white passing woman, right? And so these things they're not simple. And I worry that we slip so quickly into binaries, and that keeps us from taking time to actually see and know and understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that manifests in all forms of hate.
And I value how you're complicating that and bringing nuance to that. So thank you. Now moving into the allyship piece. So I dug up some numbers, and a Canadian hate crime report found that although Jews account for less than 1% of the population, they were the victims in 70% of all hate crimes in 2023, with a reported 71 increase in anti-Jewish hate crimes over the previous year. And then similarly, in 2024, the FBI recorded a record high rate of hate crimes against Jews in the US. On December 18th, the Montreal Gazette published an opinion piece that you wrote called "We Jews Can't Solve Anti-Semitism on Our Own." And the subtitle reads, "Ask yourself, when the news cycle shifts away from Bondi Beach, what will we be doing proactively to make our society a more peaceful place?" So in that spirit, what does meaningful allyship towards Jewish communities look like in everyday practice? And I'm going to include the link to that article in the show notes for those who are curious to read the whole thing.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. There's so many levels to this. And I want to note that the numbers that you shared don't surprise me at all. They're numbers that I know. I hope that your listeners sit with them. I hope that they're surprised by them, right? They're shocking numbers. There's so many levels because there's so much need for response, right? So people who are leaders in government, in universities, in business, I think have a role in terms of how we set expectations for how we treat each other in our institutions, what legislation we put out there to make sure that freedom of speech is protected, but not in such a way that it leads to hateful acts, right? It's not easy, but it's also not rocket science, right? There are tools, there are ways to balance these values and to take it seriously and make change. And I think part of what was so sobering of Bondi Beach is members of the Australian Jewish community, like members of the Canadian Jewish community, have been saying for years now, something bad is going to happen. You have to do something. We don't want that, right? I don't want it to take that kind of massacre for someone to pay attention and say, oh, I guess we should have done something. They had the same kind of increase in violent rhetoric, the same increase in graffiti and violent acts that kind of shaped the society in such a way that the level of what was tolerable in terms of anti-Semitism shifted. And so I think that one piece is to say, for those who do have decision-making power and don't want this to happen on their watch, there's a need to be proactive and not just reactive. Reactive happens after people are killed for being Jewish. I would much rather not be a martyr to this, right? And have something proactive by way of response. But I think there's also just the person to person, parent to parent, coworker to coworker piece of not feeling like you have to understand all of the things that are complicated to make simple human gestures, right? The same way you would check in with somebody if they'd had a loss in their family, to understand that for many of us as Jews, we're part of this Jewish family, that we're only 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from people across the world from us. And to say, hey, I heard this happened. Did you know anybody impacted? Are you okay? You know, how are you feeling? Or to do things that signal that it's a space where one can be publicly out and Jewish without fear, right? I mean, there's so many parallels, I think, with other identities where some of us can pass. So if you look at being gay, for example, right? If I'm in conversation with somebody and they say to me, oh, you know, just a casual person I meet on a plane, and they say to me, oh, what does your husband do? Right? I then need to think to myself, am I going to explain that I don't have a husband? I actually have a wife. What might that, you know, what kind of reaction might that prompt in the person next to me? It makes it much easier for me to just deflect, change the topic, not engage, right? Whereas if someone says to me, oh, you're married, tell me about your partner, leads to a very, very different conversation. Similarly, such a simple thing, you know, I've got no problem with someone saying Merry Christmas, but if someone says, oh, were your kids excited to see presents under the tree? That's very different than saying, oh, what do you do for the holidays? Right? And so there are all of these small ways that each of us can be an ally in so many areas. And again, it's not rocket science. It just requires stopping and thinking and realizing that not everybody might live the life that you're living, um or to make assumptions, right? Of those kinds. It really, some of it is really so simple and so human.
Yeah. And in your op-ed, you have 3 specific suggestions as well, and I'll point listeners and readers to that through the show notes. I wonder, in moments when prejudice and hate is on the rise, like as it is, silence may sometimes feel easier than speaking up. How do you feel about moral courage, especially for those who don't see themselves as activists or leaders?
Such a good question. You know, moral courage is a big phrase. And I think if you say to most people, oh, are you morally courageous? I don't know that they would know how to answer a question like that. And I do think that we have an instinct, which sometimes often comes from a good place of like, I don't know what to say, so I'm just not going to say anything. But the best parallel I can think is if you know that somebody has a loss or is living with a serious illness or whatever it is, your basic choice is, do you show up or do you not show up? And 9 times out of 10, if you're not showing up, it's for your own self-preservation, not for the sake of that other person, right? And so it's okay to say, hey, I don't know what to say, but I was thinking of you and I wanted to check in with you. That's worth its weight in gold, right? You don't have to know everything. You just have to have a willingness to reach out as a human being to another human being in terms of that other piece, right? That's separate from the kind of questions of what does a government do? What does a society do? Which are very real and important questions, right? I can't and don't want to pretend those don't exist. But in terms of what helps people feel more seen and more safe and less alone, those are pretty key.
So I mean, this is super segue to the question that I was going to ask. I'm sort of closing in and now going to focus a little bit more specifically on empathy. So for those who maybe feel uncertain or afraid of saying the wrong thing, what role do you think curiosity plays in building empathy across a divide?
I mean, you're the scholar of empathy, not me. But what I do know is that I don't think you can have empathy without curiosity, right? You have to actually care about what somebody else's experience is. Louise Penny, in one of her books, talks about this idea of shadow emotions that I think is Buddhist originally. I'm not sure, but this notion that there are certain responses that can be confused with one another, but are actually quite different. So if you look at empathy versus sympathy, right? Sympathy is ultimately distancing. It's, oh, poor you, victim over there, I feel badly for you, which is very different from, I see you as a human being who's having a different experience, and I care about you, so I care to know more about your experience, and I'm curious about that, right? Those are, I think one of those responses closes doors and another of those responses opens doors. And I think that it connects to what we were saying before, right? Because if you have all of these binaries, oppressor, oppressed, good, bad, um, it's very easy to dismiss people and not to be curious about them, right? And that's a really problematic path.
Love that. Before I ask my final question, I want to know if there's anything that you'd like to address that we haven't talked about, or if there's just one invitation to listeners that you'd like to make or extend from this conversation. What would you like that to be?
Such a big question. I think humility matters. I think that these things are all connected: empathy, curiosity, humility. To not go into an encounter assuming that you know everything, either about what the other person's thinking or feeling, or about any given situation, right? To have the courage of your convictions, to have your own integrity. Absolutely, those things matter. But we lose something profound when we lose a sense of shared humanity, and when we lose the understanding that that person sitting across from me may have very different hopes and fears and beliefs and values, but they certainly have them, right? And that they're not two-dimensional and they're not a means to an end, right? I think that one of the things that's been so challenging is, you say that number about Jews as 1% of the population and 70% of hate crimes. And there's probably someone out there on some level, consciously or unconsciously, thinking, oh, well, they must have done something to deserve it, right? It's the equivalent of saying of a rape victim, well, what was she wearing? Or of saying to a woman, well, if you're strong and powerful in one setting, it can't be that somebody hurt you in another setting. But it's Whitman who said it, right? We contain multitudes, all of us. And it's a hell of a lot more work to see that in each other and to have that shape our interactions. But if we lose that, we lose a tremendous amount. So I think that what I would lean into is the aspects of humanity and humility and compassion and care and empathy. And curiosity, right? How vitally important those things are. That's probably plenty. That's probably plenty. It's not as succinct as I would like, but
No, are
there's
you
a lot
kidding me?
here.
You were right to call it as a big question, and look at you, just really leaned hard
It's
into
not a
that.
zero-sum game, right? Being human and caring is not a zero-sum game. And we lose sight about that as a peril, at our peril. Nobody wants to be a victim. Nobody wants to be an oppressor. There's got to be better ways of understanding things and living with each other and building something together. And maybe the only other takeaway that seems to me so key is that we've got to get better at being proactive and not reactive. I think, again, so many people are scared about going out on a limb and saying something or doing something that we just don't do it. And maybe the only other thing, now that you've got me going, that I would add is like, social media is not real life. It's just, there are wonderful real aspects to it. There are terrible real aspects to it. But posting something or reposting something, like, that doesn't count by and large as doing something.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. And it's not what we need to be putting our energy into judging each other for or condemning each other for. I'm much less interested in, like, what are you posting than what are you actually doing when you step away from the screen.
Yeah. Fair. All great ways to answer that question. So we're at the end of our conversation, and with the last couple of minutes left, and I want to thank you so much for the hour that we spent together. I've been asking you questions more in your role of Rabbi Grushcow, and now I may ask you more as Lisa, if you'll indulge. If you could think of a moment in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
Not as Rabbi Grushcow, but as Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't get away with, like, the supportive sign someone put on the door of our synagogue, because that was good.
You could do that too.
Oh, goodness. Huh. All right, so something totally different comes to mind. So thank you for the question. So I moved to Montreal back in 2012, moved back to Montreal, and a year into being in this position and having moved my kids to this city, my marriage ended. And I remember there was someone who just unannounced knocked on my door, came in, said, I've been where you are. Are you okay? Here are some of the things that helped me. And it was such a meaningful moment. I don't know if this person would remember it or not, but just that moment of human connection and care that precisely doesn't have to do with the roles, but just this shared humanity that we have.
I love this question because I never know what answer I'm going to get. And it never surprises me that people can think of something. And when they speak to the moment, they're reminded of how great that empathic extension felt. And it's something that I think we can all do a little bit more of. I call it turning up the volume of empathy in our lives. But thank you for that story.
That's such a great phrase, turning up the volume of empathy. The way I think of it sometimes is like exercising those muscles, whether it's hope or empathy or curiosity, right? This stuff takes work, but it's the best thing there is. It's what makes us human.
Well, thank you for spending this hour with me. And I have it in mind in 2026 to bring my daughter to an event at your temple sometime.
Oh, I'd love that. You'd be very welcome.
So have a great start to 2026. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And I want to thank everybody who's been watching or listening. And we'll see you next week at Purposeful.
Thank you so much.
If you know someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them now. Post the link to your socials, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.